Welcome back, everybody. So, today we're going to talk about The Story of an Hour by Kate Chopin, and we are going to discuss it in terms of character development most specifically. There are other elements in the story that we can focus on as well, as far as setting and point of view go. Remember, our essay one is going to be focused on character development, setting, or point of view, so you need to kind of keep that in mind as you're reading The Story of an Hour, whichever one that you'd like to focus on. But for the purposes of this particular lesson, we're going to focus on character development or characterization. Before we get started, I want to talk to you about literature and its function, which is basically, I want you to think about literature as representative of life, because that is a lot of times what authors are attempting to do. They're trying to represent life in a way that they understand their conception of life. They may want to use their literature to develop an idea that they feel should be the way something is, the way that it is actually in their particular time frame, or in a way that is completely dystopian. But no matter what, we can always glean some information about a particular author's surroundings. And I want you to think about, like I said, literature as life. I want you to think about each character that you see in literature as something that resides in, if you want to think about that old saying, oh, it's all black and white as far as life goes, choices go. It's not. Nothing in life is actually black and white. Well, I won't say nothing. The only thing that is an absolute in life is that not everything is or nothing is always something or never something, right? So the same holds true in literature. A lot of times characters will have, that sort of black and white distinction imposed upon them, but a majority of the time, these characters, just like people, fall into that gray area, that in between. And the reason for that is because as art is representative of life, these characters themselves are representative of people. Okay, so I want you to keep that in mind. There is no perfectly understandable truth, there is no perfectly understandable anything. Okay, everything is nuanced in literature just like it is in life. Okay, so that's my little spiel about literature up front before we get started on our first analysis here. So I want us to um, think about character development or characterization in terms of how we understand a character that we see in the story. I want you to think about, if this were a person, who would they be? Who are they internally? Who are they, in here, right? In here. Who is this person? Then I want you to think about who they are to the rest of the world. Who are they to their friends and their family? Who are they to society more generally? What is the expectation that's placed upon them? What is something that they do to buck this expectation? If they don't buck expectation, why don't they? If they do, why do they? Okay, the question is always going to be why. And if you keep asking yourself that, then you'll get to the heart of analysis. Okay, as far as characterization goes as well, you want to think about how who this character is impacts their understanding of the world, right? Just like people, characters are biased. Characters have opinions. So I want you to think in terms of what their biases are, what their opinions are, and how those two things reconcile to provide an understanding of what their world is. And is this understanding of what their world is it the true description or true depiction of what their world actually is? Okay, I want you to keep that in mind as you read. So I want to go through the characters in the story of an hour really quickly. So we have Louise Mallard, we have Brentley Mallard, Josephine, Richards, and the doctors. Okay, these are the only characters that we see. So I want you to think about what each of these characters brings to the story. We've obviously got Louise Mallard, who the story mainly focuses upon. Okay, she is the main character, the protagonist. She is the person that we see most of all, and we see most of her. We see her thoughts, and we see her fears, and we see her interests and her excitement. Right? We see all of these things about Louise. We have Brentley, who we know a lot about, but we know a lot about Brentley through Louise. Okay, so I want you to keep that in mind. Everything we know about Brentley only comes to us secondhand. And then we have Josephine, who is Louise's sister. What do we know about Josephine? Well, we know a little bit of things. We know how she interacts with Louise. We know how she interacts a little bit with Richards. And, that's really all that we know. Okay, then we have Richards. We see a little bit of his motivation in paragraph 2. We see a little bit about him there. We see him again at the end in paragraph 19, and we see just a touch of who he is. Okay, and then we have the doctors. We have one thing that the doctors say right at the end, the last sentence. Okay, and that is how they are kind of shown in the context of the story. But since Louise Mallard is the main character, I want to focus mainly on her. Okay, I want you to think about some things. I want you to think, who is Louise Mallard? Okay, who is she in terms of her husband? Who is she in terms of her sister? Who is she to Richards? I apologize for the typo on the screen. It is Richards, it's his last name. So who is she to Richards? Who is she to the doctors? And who is she to herself? So to think about it, who is she to Brentley? Well, to Brentley, she's his wife, right? To think about things in general terms, she's his wife. She is someone that he obviously cared about. You can see that in um, paragraph 11, where she identifies him as a person who she would weep again for when she saw the kind, tender hands folded in death, the face that had never looked save with love upon her. Right? We know that he is a man who cared deeply for Louise. Okay, so he is her husband in that sense. Now, if you were to look at the Burkove article, you would see a different depiction of their relationship. You would see, Louise as a, sort of unrelenting person who just does not want to be within her marriage. I'm not sure how incredibly accurate that is. Uh, sure, for us, she doesn't seem to want to be in her marriage, but I don't know how destructive that want is. And I know that Burkove really, really does feel that that is super destructive. So we want to think about, you know, who she is on her own merits, and then we'll kind of go back through with Burkove again and kind of think about the nuance there. So to her husband, she is a wife. She's a person who manages the household. We only ever see her in the home. She looks out the window, but she doesn't leave. We see her locked in a room. We see her locked in the house. Okay, all of these things say something about who Louise is in terms of her husband. If we think of the house as representative of their marriage, she is confined in that house, confined in that marriage. Now, who is she to her sister? Well, she is someone who has a heart condition, someone who needs to be carefully told information. In fact, when Louise runs into her room, Josephine was kneeling before the closed door. This is paragraph 15, with her lips to the keyhole, imploring for her admission. Louise, open the door. I beg, open the door. You will make yourself ill. What are you doing, Louise? For heaven's sake, open the door. Right? So Josephine maybe hears something that Louise is going through inside the room. This is just when she's identified that her body and soul is free in paragraph 14. So we know that Josephine may have some sort of indication, but based on social expectation of the time, Josephine may think that Louise has had some sort of mental break, right? She's obviously a frail, weak woman in Josephine's mind, and in Richard's mind as well. Um, and so she's checking up on her. So Josephine plays almost a maternal role in that way. Then we have Richards. Who is she to Richards? Well, she's someone who he cares to share the information in a tender way. In fact, when Brentley Mallard's name, this is paragraph 2, was leading the list of killed, he had only taken the time to assure himself of its truth by a second telegram, and had hastened to forestall any less careful, less tender friend in bearing the sad message. So Richards obviously cares about Brentley and Louise. He cares about them as a couple. He cares enough to want to be the person that disseminates that information. Okay, so you want to think about it in terms of, you know, his relationship with Louise. Also, later on in the story, when Brentley walks through the door, you want to remember too that Richards made a quick motion, this is paragraph 19, to screen him from the view of his wife. Okay, so he tries to hide Brentley from Louise, and you can make an assumption, or at least you can infer, that he may have done this in order to save her the shock, to save her the trouble of getting that information so intensely immediately, right? He wanted to break the news of his life just as he wanted to break the news of Brentley's death. Okay, so he obviously thinks she's a frail woman who, needs hand holding. Now, as far as the doctors go, they consider her as just another woman, right? Because she's died of heart disease, of the joy that kills. Did she actually die of joy? Did she die of surprise? Did she die of disappointment? We don't know, right? Everything is conjecture. Based on what she says up in the room, you can assume, you can infer again, you can opine that she was not joyful at the sight of Brentley, but we don't know. Okay, but the doctors, and here's where it's important to remember this, the doctors infer themselves that she died of her heart disease, her heart condition, but of the joy that kills, right? She sees her husband, she's so elated, he's alive, oh my goodness, it's so great, and then she dies, right? So you want to think of her in terms of all of these other people around her, and then consider Louise by who she thinks she is herself. Okay, she is a person who was maybe unhappy in her marriage. Okay, she, in paragraph 13, indicates she had loved him sometimes. Often she had not. What did it matter? What could love, the unsolved mystery, count for in the face of this possession of self assertion, which she suddenly recognized as the strongest impulse of her being? Right? So she's finding that she's no longer repressed by this institution of marriage, by Brentley, and she's kind of feeling herself, figuring out kind of where she sits. And then she utters, free, body and soul free. And she kept whispering this, right? So this is something that doesn't just happen once, it's something that happens multiple times. She keeps doing this. Okay, so the fact that she repeats this should be a signal to you that this is important. So she is longing for that freedom. But what is that freedom from? Is it from Brentley? Is it from her life? Is it from her marriage? Is it from society? We don't know. Okay, but we do know that she has this yearning, and she now is feeling assertive enough to recognize that that yearning exists. Okay, so that is the big thing that we want to focus on in terms of Louise. She hears this bad news. Her first reaction is overwhelming, an overwhelming show of grief. She's crying, she's upset. Oh, it's so bad, it's so bad. Oh my God, Bradley died. And then she removes herself from this space where that would be the expectation, and she can think about it without having other people judge her reaction. And that is something that is telling. Okay, did anyone else feel like that first overwhelming display of grief in paragraph 3, where the narrator says she did not hear the story as many women have heard the same, with a paralyzed inability to accept its significance? She wept at once with sudden, wild abandonment in her sister's arms. And then, when the storm of grief had spent itself, she went away to her room alone. What do we know about storms? A storm happens. It might be an awful storm. It might be a light storm. This one appears to be an awful storm if we're going to carry with that storm metaphor. And then storms clear up, right? They move on. They disappear from the area that you can perceive. So this storm leaves, and Louise is left, now in paragraph 4, facing the open window with a comfortable, roomy armchair. Into this comfortable, roomy armchair, she sinks, okay? Pressed down by a physical exhaustion that haunted her body and seemed to reach into her soul. So she seems like she's still grieving here, okay? And then she starts to notice things. She notices through the window that the tops of trees were all aquiver with new spring life, that the delicious breath of rain was in the air. I don't know about you, but if I were grieving, a death that was unexpected, I don't know if I'd be thinking about the breath of rain in the air as delicious, right? Plus, we also need to think symbolically. Rain has ended, which means new beginnings are coming, okay? Um, then she hears a peddler crying his wares, people doing normal, everyday things. She also hears the notes of a distant song that someone was singing, right? All of these things are things that she's noticing, things that she may not have noticed on any other day, things that she may have noticed on any other day. We don't know, except for what the narrator is telling us in this hour that she hears this news, the hour after she hears it, okay? But the things that she's focusing on, the trees that are aquiver with new spring life, again, new beginnings, new life, okay? The delicious breath of rain. We hear the peddler. We hear that distant song. And then in paragraph 6, she goes on to talk about how there were patches of blue sky showing here and there through the clouds, okay? And they were all facing her window, right? All of these things should be signals to us that um, she's sensing hope, okay? Hope is coming, right? So she's getting all this information, and she's focusing on these positive things, which suggests that she's in a positive frame of mind. Okay, so she gets this freedom and she is excited by the freedom. So we want to think of that. Okay, now I want to move forward and think about what we know about Mrs. Mallard. Okay, if Brentley Mallard were not presumed dead and the news was not delivered that he was, would Louise have ever realized she could have these feelings? I want us to think about it, okay? Would she have ever tried to make the changes that she comes to enjoy, right? She obviously, at first, when she had this excited feeling in paragraph 10, right, her bosom rosing and falling tumultuously, recognizing this thing that was approaching to possess her, and she abandons herself. Now, if that weren't the case, if she never went through this rationalization, if she never went through this realization, would she have ever come to the conclusion that she desperately wanted freedom? Would she have ever come to these changes, this idea of freedom, this excitement for her freedom, without this particular imposition into her life? Well, in paragraph 17, she indicates, or the narrator indicates for us, her fancy was running riot along those days ahead of her, spring days and summer days and all sorts of days that would be her own. She breathed a quick prayer that life might be long. It was only yesterday she had thought with a shudder that life might be long, right? So there is some indication that she was unhappy, that she was feeling confined, okay? But she didn't seem to think she could do anything about it, right? She just thought with a shudder. Okay, we can think about things with a shudder all we want. Does it make changes? No. Now this change is made for her, and she's now excited about her choices. She's feeling um, she's feeling elated that she has this hope of freedom. Okay, so I don't know, personally, I don't know. Maybe you know. Maybe you have more insight into this than I do at this point. But I don't know if she would ever have made those changes to find her freedom. And that's an important thing to consider. Hey guys, I'm back. Sorry, I had to take a brief break for class, so if things seem a little bit disjointed. That's because they are a little bit. So I apologize for that. So I want to talk about who these other characters are in the story, right? We've talked a lot about Louise, um, and really that's because we see mostly what she has to say, and what she has to do, her behaviors, that sort of thing. But we haven't really touched too much on Brentley or Josephine, Richards, or the doctors. Okay, so as far as Brentley goes, we only know of Brentley through Louise, right? Brentley could be the nicest guy ever. In fact, Louise suggests that he might be in paragraph 11 when she says that she knew she would weep again when she saw the kind, tender hands folded in death, the face that had never looked save with love upon her, fixed and gray and dead. Right, so she's recognizing that she's going to be sad when she sees this man who always looked with kindness on her. And if he always looked with kindness on her, then that suggests that he's probably treated her fairly well. Um, but obviously, Louise is unhappy with the way that their relationship is functioning, whether it's because of the fact that she's uncomfortable in her marriage, whether she's uncomfortable with the institution of marriage, whether it's something else, right? Something's not working, but it's not necessarily Brentley. But I do want to say is that I want to say that Louise's perspective on Brentley, her idea of who he is as a character, is somehow overshadowed by these other complications, right? She recognizes that he's a good man, but he's also a man that in paragraph 12 she identifies that she would be able to live for herself, meaning not for Brentley, and there would be no powerful will, supposedly his, right, bending hers in that blind persistence with which men and women believe they have the right to impose a private will upon a fellow creature. A kind intention or a cruel intention made the act seem no less a crime as she looked upon it in that brief moment of illumination. So we have Brentley Mallard, who is a kind man, who's always acted kindly toward her. But we also see that he is that powerful will who bends hers, um, to impose a private will. So, what is that private will? Really, it's hard to tell. It could very well be the expectations that marriage places upon Louise. He could just be a representation of the society and the expectation of the marriage contract itself, right? That would be my best interpretation. But if you have another interpretation, then that's fabulous, and you should totally roll with that, as long as you can prove it in the text. So Brentley, to me, seems like a good guy. He seems like he has good intentions because even though he does impose this private will, the next thing that she says is that a kind intention or a cruel intention make the act seem no less a crime. And that would suggest that it seems no less a crime to the person who is being imposed upon, right? So we've got that kind intention listed first, and then cruel intention later, suggesting that Brentley probably is the former. Okay, he probably does have that kind intention, but it's the act itself that makes Louise uncomfortable. Okay, so you want to think in terms of that way. But as I said before, if you have another interpretation, go with it. Okay, just back it up with information from the text. And then we have Josephine. And we don't know too much about Josephine, except that she's the one who breaks the news to Louise, right? She actually tells Louise in paragraph 3, no, paragraph 2, tells Louise in paragraph 2 that she tells Louise in broken sentences, veiled hints that revealed in half concealing. Okay, so she tells her without really telling her. She hints at it, she suggests it, but doesn't actually say it, right? And so that's important because she doesn't actually transmit this information, okay? She does, but not explicitly. So we know that she's being careful of Louise's heart trouble, her heart condition, whatever that is, whether that's literal, whether that's metaphorical, if it's a physical issue or an emotional issue, we're not sure. We don't know. Um, there's not really enough information to tell, but she does reveal the information to Louise in one way, shape, or form, subtly, but it's still revealed. Um, so we know that. We also know that she's worried about Louise because once Louise leaves, okay, once she leaves, she is sorry, I'm not sure why that's there, or that. What is happening? So once she leaves, then we have um, she being Louise goes into her room. Josephine follows her. Okay, once Louise leaves, Josephine follows her into her room. And we see that Josephine is kneeling before the closed door with her lips to the keyhole. This is paragraph 15, imploring for admission. Louise, open the door, I beg, open the door. You will make yourself ill. What are you doing, Louise? For heaven's sake, open the door. So we see that Josephine is worried for her sister. She's there, she's trying to get her to open the door. She wants to check on her. Likely she hears Louise whispering, free, body and soul, free, over and over and over again. She's probably thinking Louise is having some sort of mental breakdown. Okay, so we want to keep in mind that maybe Louise isn't well, right? Josephine certainly thinks that Louise isn't well, otherwise she wouldn't be begging to get into the room. So she cares about her, she wishes for her well-being, and then we see her again at the end. Um, we see her again, and we see that she's helping Louise down the stairs. Okay, so she's providing physical support as well as emotional support. And then we see Josephine cry at the mention of, or not at the mention, at the witnessing that Bentley come in through the front door, right? So she makes the cry, which is expected of Louise. And honestly, we're not quite sure whether she makes the cry because Brentley comes in, and we're not sure if she makes the cry because Louise falls down dead. We don't know, right? It's written ambiguously. This is all paragraph 19. Okay, it's all written ambiguously. We don't know. The one thing that we do know is that Josephine obviously cares for Louise. That's the big thing. She's support. Okay, but she's also a support that believes in this social structure of marriage in the times of that this was written, so 1894. And then we have Richards. What do we know about Richards? So we know that he's a friend of Brentley and Louise's, and the reason that we know that is because it's identified to us in paragraph 2. Okay, it was he who had been in the newspaper office when intelligence of the railroad disaster was received, with Brentley Mallard's name leading the list of killed. He had only taken the time to assure himself of its truth by a second telegram, and had hastened to forestall any less careful, less tender friend in bearing the sad message. So Richards cares about Brentley, and by extension, he cares about Louise. So when he hears the news about Brentley's death, he wants to deliver it personally so that he can be sure that it's done from somebody who Louise knows, who she's comfortable with, and um, who's aware of her heart condition and her limitations, okay, whatever those may be. So we see that, and then he sort of disappears for a while. He's obviously still downstairs because we see him again at the end, and in paragraph 19, it's mentioned really quickly right at the end that Richards makes a quick motion to screen Brentley from the view of Brentley's wife, so from Louise's view. Why would he try to screen Brentley from Louise's view, right? He obviously cares about Louise. He doesn't want to shock her, right? So he's looking to protect Louise from the shock, the emotional shock, the physical shock that she might end up feeling from seeing Brentley. So this is something that we want to think about. All of these people so far care about Louise. And then we have Louise, who obviously also cares about Louise. So that's kind of cool. Now, let's switch over to the doctors a little bit, because this is where things get a little bit different. So, the doctors, in this particular case, you can argue that doctors are representative of the community, okay? Because they're present in paragraph 20 right at the end, and it says, when the doctors came in, they said she had died of heart disease, of the joy that kills, okay? So, the doctors are identifying her death, her cause of death, as joy, overexcitement, and at the unexpected and wonderful sight of Brentley walking through the door when she thought he was dead. So the doctors are disseminating this information to everybody, to Brentley, to Josephine, to Richards, to likely other people in town. This is a small town. You can gather by the fact that you can hear peddlers crying their wares, and you can hear someone singing a song in the distance out the window when Louise was up in her room. So it's a small town. Everyone's going to know. So the doctors hold the keys to being able to communicate all of that information. Okay. So that being said, something else I want to point out on this slide is that each of these characters, Brentley, Richards, and the doctors, the three of them, the three male characters, okay, multiple doctors, but we can still gather that they are male. So these three characters or groups of characters all are characters who actively transmit information. We have Brentley, who reveals that he's alive just by the fact that he walks through the door. We have Richards, who comes in and not only gets the information from the newspaper office, confirms it, even though that wasn't a good confirmation, and then passes on the information to Josephine so she can tell Louise, right? He is actively transmitting information. He is interacting with the information and passing it on. And then we have the doctors who actively pass on the information regarding Louise's heart disease, right? What she died from, that joy that kills, imposing their view upon her death. So we have those three characters or groups of characters. The other two characters, then, Josephine and Louise, you can think of them as passive characters when it comes to, um, processing news. They receive the news and they process it in their own right, but they don't actually tell anyone. They don't pass on news. Now, you might say, well, Josephine does, but she really doesn't. She makes Louise figure it out. Like we were talking about before, Josephine, in paragraph 2, speaks in broken sentences and in veiled hints that revealed and half concealing. So she doesn't actually tell Louise anything about the situation. She doesn't. She hints at it until Louise figures it out for herself. And then Louise doesn't pass on any information to anyone except for the reader. She doesn't really talk to anyone except for Josephine to tell her to go away when she's locked up in the room and Josephine's concerned about her. So we have, these female characters who are passive consumers of information. They don't question it, they just take it in. And then we have these male characters who are the active participants in the conversations, in the interactions. They're the ones presenting information while Josephine and Louise are accepting it, right? So we have that type of dynamic happening between these characters as well. So, sorry. So let's move on to this next slide here. We have the reminder that The Story of an Hour was published in 1894. So this should make a difference in how we see Mrs. Mallard, right? We can think of her in terms of 2020, but in terms of 2020, you know what? Like, sure, maybe it's a little strange that she, wails and cries in a storm of grief at the first mention of her husband's death, and then goes in her room and seems like she's fine, everything's cool. Oh, hey, I've got some freedom, right? Maybe that self love that she feels is appropriate for 2020, but in 1894, is it? 1894 is still a time when marriages were happening as more of an exchange of currency than anything else. It was, a man going to a woman's father asking for her hand in marriage and his approval. He says yes, and did anyone ask the woman? Maybe, maybe not, right? So it was more of a business transaction than anything else. So marriage becomes this pervasive, oppressive thing in a pervasive, oppressive structure, I guess is a better way to say it, in 1894 than it is now when there's more freedom to, enter into and leave from marriages. Okay? Another thing I want you to think about is how does the fact that this is 1894 influence what we know about Brentley? Well, we know that, Louise felt like he imposed his will upon her. But what will is that? Is that the will of the expectations of marriage, the expectations of her being a wife, right? In 1894, these expectations would be very real. They wouldn't be something that's really negotiated. This would be, okay, society says that as a wife, Louise must do this and this and this, and then she has to, right? Um, so the fact that, Brentley seems to impose a will upon Louise in terms of it being 1894 doesn't really make him out of the ordinary. Again, in 2020, well, yeah, that might be out of the ordinary. For some relationships, yes, for some relationships, no. Okay? And as far as what we know about Richards, well, there's a little bit that we know about Richards that, he's in the newspaper office, and some of you may feel like, well, he probably should have done a little more to check up on this information, right? And that's a fair reading, right? That's a fair interpretation of what you're seeing. But you also want to think, okay, so newspapers, telegrams, right? These are all things that are happening that are slow. Okay, nothing is happening fast here. So we've got Richards, and he's working with this information. He's confirming as best as he can. He sends a second telegram to make sure that the information that he does get is correct. And even though he does mess it up, right? Brentley's not dead, but he also is trying his best to double check his source. So the limitations of technology are really what hurts the information that Richards is passing on, not necessarily his lack of sleuthing to figure out what the situation actually is. Okay, he checked, and really, can we expect more from him in 1894? I don't necessarily think that we can. If you feel like we can, then make that argument, and that's fair. You just need to have information from your source to back that up. So there's something else I want you to consider, which is the significance of Louise Mallard's heart condition. Okay, who controls the narrative around that heart condition? Well, we already said the doctors diagnose, right? So men are diagnosing. Um, and how does that matter to Louise in the long term? Well, men are diagnosing, men are controlling her health care, men are controlling her life at home, men are controlling her life in other ways, right? So this repression that she feels could very well just stem from that systematic oppression that she feels from the patriarchal society. That's a definite possibility. Everyone who controls her is a man. Josephine does try to control her, but Louise doesn't let her, right? We only see male figures trying to or actually controlling Louise. So this heart condition and who diagnoses it is a big deal. Okay. Now, as far as Louise's own heart condition, what she feels about it, well, she doesn't really talk about it, does she? We hear about it from the narrator on two different counts. We know that the doctors confirm it at the end, but Louise isn't really worried. Sure, she did just get news of her husband's death, but she's not super upset. She's thinking, okay, well, like this happened, freedom, freedom, and now at this point, we see the only mention of her heart throughout the story, which is paragraph 10. Now her bosom rose and fell tumultuously. She was beginning to recognize this thing that was approaching her to possess her, and she was striving to beat it back with her will, as powerless as her two white, slender hands would have been. When she abandoned herself a little, a whispered word escaped her slightly parted lips. She said it over and over under the breath: free, free, free. The vacant stare and the look of terror that followed it went from her eyes. They stayed keen and bright. Her pulses beat fast, and the coursing blood warmed and relaxed every inch of her body. Okay, so this is the only mention of her heart, her physical condition, except for that shrieking in the grief of a storm that she does earlier. And we have this idea that is represented by the narrator about her pulse beating fast, her coursing blood warming and relaxing every inch of her body, right? All of these things. Do they suggest that she's thinking about her heart condition? No, it's just reporting the data. Louise never thinks, oh, it hurts. I'm having such emotional turmoil. I might have heart problems. She doesn't think that. We don't hear that. And honestly, we hear a lot of what she's thinking. So you would think we would. And beyond that, she's excited here. Okay? And if she's not concerned when her heart's working overtime, that seems a little strange. Okay? It seems like she disregards this diagnosis, and whether that diagnosis is disregarded because it is something that was, introduced by a male figure, I don't know. Whether she just doesn't think of it because she's too involved in her emotions, I'm not sure. It's a possibility. But we really can't know. But we do know that she doesn't talk about it. She doesn't bring it up. So that's a little bit strange. All right, so then let's look at this final question here. And this is something, these are some things that I'm going to pose to you. So think about this. So would our interpretation of these characters be different if the story of an hour were published in 1994 instead of 1894? Why? If you say yes, why would it be different? If you say no, why wouldn't it be different? Okay? And then I want you to think about, would reading this story from a different cultural perspective change the way that we perceive these characters? If this wasn't, if we weren't thinking of it from the perspective of living in the United States in 2020, if we were living elsewhere, what would that perception be? Okay? Consider these things. Now, these are, again, things that we can't possibly know for sure. But like I said earlier in the video, we can never know for sure. So we can posit suggestions and we can attempt to make educated guesses, which is part of what analysis is. Okay, so I'm going to leave you guys with that on this video. I know I said earlier in the video that I would talk about fatal self-assertion and Kate Chopin's The Story of an Hour, but I'm going to actually post that in a separate video for you so that we can talk about it individually. This video is getting kind of long and I don't want to prolong it any more than this. Okay, so look out for another video about fatal self-assertion and Kate Chopin's The Story of an Hour, and I will see you guys when you watch it. All right, have a great night.